Good afternoon. We gather this afternoon to hear tales, winter tales, and all season tales told in winter. Now you know, if you did not know before, that this year's theme, Glazed with Rainwater, comes from a Carlos Williams poem. We chose the line for its beauty and its mystery, and to reflect the power that images carry. Now we have the poem itself. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So much depends. It's as if we had looked out our window in our favorite art gallery, come across a painting, or seen an image while walking or driving. Our red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, is there. A snapshot. An ordinary object made extraordinary by our seeing. William Carlos Williams, imagist, poet, and physician, was a force in American modernism. In his poems, ideas arise from concrete, everyday objects. His poem's beginning, so much depends. What depends? What depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater? Somehow we know. History Matters, published in 2025, is a collection of writings by beloved historian David McCullough that is edited by his daughter and his prime researcher. John Meacham writes the foreword. David McCullough's work on John Adams and Truman won Pulitzer Prizes. His other well-known works are 1776, The Pioneers, The Wright Brothers, The Path Between the Seas, The Creation of the Panama Canal, 1870 to 1914, and The American Spirit, Who We Are and What We Stand For.
History Matters. The interviewer asked McCullough, "Would you tell us about the motto tacked over your desk?" And McCullough responds, "It says, 'Look at your fish.' It's the test that Louis Agassiz, the 19th century Harvard naturalist, gave every new student. He would take an odorous old fish out of a jar, set it in a tin pan in front of the student and say, 'Look at your fish.' Then Agassiz would leave. When he came back, he would ask that student what he had seen. Well, not very much, most of them would say. And Agassiz would say it again, 'Look at your fish.' This could go on for days. The student would be encouraged to draw the fish, but could use no tools for the examination. just hands and eyes. Samuel Scudder, who later became a famous entomologist and an expert on grasshoppers, left us the best account of his ordeal of the fish. After several days, Scudder could still not see whatever it was Agassiz wanted him to see. But he said, "I see how little I saw before." Then Scudder had a brainstorm and he announced it to Agassiz the next morning. Parrot organs, the same on both sides. Of course, Agassiz said, very pleased. So Scudder naturally asked what he should do next. And Agassiz said, "Look at your fish." I love that story and have used it often when teaching classes on writing because seeing is so important in this work. Insight comes more often than not from looking at what's been on the table all along in front of everybody rather than from discovering something new. Seeing is as much the job of an historian as it is of a poet or a painter. And that's Charles Dickens' greatest admonition to all writers: make me see. The interviewer then asked McCullough, "Have you had Scudder moments?" And McCullough responded, "Oh, yes. I suppose the most vivid one, when I actually felt something like a charge of electricity run up my spine, was while I was working on the puzzle of young Theodore Roosevelt's asthma. Hoping to pin down the cause of his attacks, I had been talking to a physician who raised such questions as whether there was a dog or a cat in the house, or if the attacks occurred during the pollen season. Then a specialist in psychosomatic aspects of the illness suggested a different approach. Did the attacks come before or after some big event, or before the boy's birthday, or the night before a trip, or just before, or maybe after Christmas? So using his diary entries, I made a calendar of what Roosevelt was doing every day. In pencil, I wrote where he was, who was with him, what was going on, and then in red ink, I put squares around the days of the asthma attacks. But a little like Scudder and the fish, I just couldn't see a pattern. Then, first thing one morning, without really thinking about it, I looked at the calendar lying on my desk and I saw what I'd been missing. The red boxes were all in a row. The attacks were all happening on Sunday. I thought, what happens on Sunday? Then it began to make sense. If he had an attack, he didn't have to go to church, which he hated. And his father would then take him to the country. He loved the country when it was just he and his father alone. Well, that was pure heaven. This doesn't mean the attacks were planned. Traumatic asthmatic attacks are triggered by anxiety, and Roosevelt paid a dear price for those trips to the country. There may well have been other things contributing to the attacks, but the Sunday pattern was just too pronounced to be coincidental. The interviewer asked McCullough, "What led you to become a writer?" McCullough responded, "Thornton Wilder." Thornton Wilder was a teaching fellow at my college at Yale. Here was a world-celebrated writer for us to talk to have lunch with. And imagine, he was easy to talk to and he was delightful. When Wilder was asked why he wrote books and plays, he said, "I think I write in order to discover on my shelf a new book that I would enjoy reading or to see a new play that would engross me. If it didn't exist, he wrote it so he could read it or see it." In the interview, McCullough was next asked, "When did you decide to use Thornton Wilder's words to write the book you wanted to read?" And McCullough answered, "It was when I came across a set of old photographs of the Johnstown flood. When we were little kids, we used to make a lake of gravy in our mashed potatoes. Then we'd take a fork, break the potatoes, and say, 'The Johnstown flood,' with no idea why we did it. That was about all I knew about it until I saw the photographs of the flood quite by chance at the Library of Congress. I became extremely curious to know what had happened and why. So I went to the library and found a book, and it was only so-so. The author had some of the geography of Western Pennsylvania wrong that I could see, and he didn't answer certain questions I felt he should have. I took out another book, and it was even less satisfactory. So I decided to try to write the book I wanted to read. I wasn't at all sure how to go about it. So one evening in New York, at a gathering of writers and historians interested in the West, my boss, Elvin Josephy, pointed to a white-haired man across the room. He said, "That man is Harry Drago, Harry Sinclair Drago. He's written over 100 books." I waited for my chance and I walked over. "Mr. Drago," I said, "Elvin Josephy says that you've written over 100 books." "Well, yes," he said, "that's right." "So how do you do that?" I asked. And he said, 4 pages a day. Every day? Every day. It was the best advice an aspiring writer could be given. So I wrote the Johnstown flood at night. I would come home, we'd have dinner, put the kids to bed. Then at about 9, I would go to a little room upstairs, close the door, and start working. I tried to write not 4, but 2 pages every night. Our oldest daughter remembers going to sleep to the sound of the typewriter. In the interview, he was asked, "Did you have subjects in mind as you were working on the Johnstown flood?" And McCullough responded, "Not long after that book was published, 2 different editors asked if I'd like to do the Chicago fire or the San Francisco earthquake. I began to feel I was being a bit typecast when I had just barely started. I was going to be known as Bad News McCullough. So I said no. What had interested me most about the story of the flood were the social and political aspects of it. The book was really written about human short-sightedness, the message being that it's extremely risky, even perilous, to assume that because people hold positions of responsibility, they are therefore behaving responsibly. After I finished the book, I felt the need for a symbol of affirmation for something that was done right. One day I was having lunch in a German restaurant on the Lower East Side with an architect engineer and a science writer. They started talking about the builders of the Brooklyn Bridge and what they didn't know when they started it. The more they talked, the more I realized I had found my next subject. The interviewer asked, "How do you decide what to include, what to omit, what belongs to history, and what's just extraneous?" And McCullough responded, "Thornton Wilder talked about the difficulty of recreating the past. It lies in the effort to employ the past tense in such a way that it does not rob those events of their character of having occurred in freedom." That's the difficulty exactly. How do you write about something that happened a long time ago in a way so that it has the openness, the feeling of events happening in freedom? How to write solid history and at the same time give life to the past and see the world as it was to those vanished people with an understanding of what they didn't know. The problem with so much of history as it's taught and written is that it's so often presented as if it were all on a track. This followed that. In truth, nothing ever had to happen the way it happened. Nothing was preordained. There was always a degree of tension, of risk, and the question of what was going to happen next. The Brooklyn Bridge was built. You know that. It's standing there today, but they didn't know that at the start. Well, I feel I'm working in the tradition of historians and biographers who work in the narrative form. I love to tell a story. History, I believe, is best understood as an unfolding story. I think there's more intellectual honesty in seeing it that way from within what happened. The moment has gone, the characters are dead, but you can bring them back, recreate their ever changing lives in such a way that the story does not sound monotonous with an unrelieved tempo. Life does not come at us that way, so why should history?
The imaginative experience and the historical express equally the traditions of human reality, writes N. Scott Momaday, one of our most distinguished Native American writers. Momaday became, in 1969, the first Native American to win the Pulitzer Prize in fiction for his novel House Made of Dawn. House Made of Dawn influenced and brought attention to other writers, including Vine Deloria Jr., Leslie Silko, James Welsh. The Way to Rainy Mountain blends folklore with memoir. It is Momaday's personal journey to the grave of his Kiowa grandmother. And it is the journey of Taimi, the sacred sun dance doll, and Taimi's people, evoking Kiowa myths, legends, and history. In 2007, Momaday received the National Medal of Arts for his writings. Momaday died in 2024. Helen Hoover, The Gift of the Deer. His work was published in 1966, and it sold over 50,000 copies. Now it has been republished by the University of Minnesota Heritage Series, which publishes out-of-print books that contribute to our appreciation of Minnesota and the upper Midwest. Helen, a chemist, and her artist husband, Adrian, moved to the northern Minnesota wilderness from Chicago in 1954. They live in a 2-room log cabin every winter and some summers for 11 years. Hoover's wealth of knowledge about birds, about trees, about wildflowers fill the background of her book. But her book is primarily about the deer. And as the New York Times Book Review says, that is its lasting virtue.
From The Way to Rainy Mountain by N. Scott Momaday. A single knoll rises out of the plain in Oklahoma, north and west of the Wichita Range. For my people, the Kiowas, it is an old landmark, and they gave it the name Rainy Mountain. The hardest weather in the world is there. Winter brings blizzards, Hot tornadic winds arise in the spring, and in summer, the prairie is an anvil's edge. The grass turns brittle and brown, and it cracks beneath your feet. There are green belts along the rivers and creeks, linear groves of hickory and pecan, willow and witch hazel. At a distance, in July or August, the steaming foliage seems almost to writhe in fire. Great green and yellow grasshoppers are everywhere in the tall grass, popping up like corn to sting the flesh. And tortoises crawl about on the red earth, going nowhere in plenty of time. Loneliness is an aspect of the land. All things in the plain are isolated. There is no confusion of objects in the eye, but one hill or one tree or one man. To look upon that landscape in the early morning with the sun at your back is to lose the sense of proportion. Your imagination comes to life, and this, you think, is where creation was begun. I returned to Rainy Mountain in July. My grandmother had died in the spring, and I wanted to be at her grave. She had lived to be very old and at last infirm. Her only living daughter was with her when she died, and I was told that in her death, her face was that of a child. I like to think of her as a child. When she was born, the Kiowas were living the last great moment of their history. For more than 100 years, they had controlled the open range from the Smoky Hill River to the Red, from the headwaters of the Canadian to the fork of the Arkansas and Cimarron. In alliance with the Comanches, they had ruled the whole of the southern plains. War was their sacred business, and they were among the finest horsemen the world has ever known. But warfare for the Kiowas was preeminently a matter of disposition rather than of survival, and they never understood the grim, unrelenting advance of the U.S. cavalry. When at last, divided and ill-provisioned, they were driven onto the staked plains in the cold rains of autumn, they fell into panic. In Palo Duro Canyon, they abandoned their crucial stores to pillage and had nothing then but their lives. In order to save themselves, they surrendered to the soldiers at Fort Sill and were imprisoned in the old stone corral that now stands as a military museum. My grandmother was spared the humiliation of those high gray walls by 8 or 10 years. But she must have known from birth the affliction of defeat, the dark brooding of old warriors. Her name was Aho, and she belonged to the last culture to evolve in North America. Her forebears came down from the high country in western Montana nearly 3 centuries ago. They were a mountain people, a mysterious tribe of hunters whose language has never been positively classified in any major group. In the late 17th century, they began a long migration to the south and east. It was a journey toward the dawn, and it led to a golden age. Along the way, the Kiowas were befriended by the Crows, who gave them the culture and religion of the plains. They acquired horses, and their ancient nomadic spirit was suddenly free of the ground. They acquired Taimi, the sacred Sundance doll, from that moment the object and symbol of their worship, and so shared in the divinity of the sun. Not least, they acquired the sense of destiny, therefore courage and pride. When they entered upon the southern plains, they had been transformed. No longer were they slaves to the simple necessity of survival. They were a lordly and dangerous society of fighters and thieves, hunters and priests of the sun. According to their origin myth, They entered the world through a hollow log. From one point of view, their migration was the fruit of an old prophecy, for indeed they emerged from a sunless world. Although my grandmother lived out her long life in the shadow of Rainy Mountain, the immense landscape of the continental interior lay like memory in her blood. She could tell of the crows, whom she had never seen, and of the Black Hills, where she had never been. I wanted to see in reality what she had seen more perfectly in the mind's eye, and traveled 1,500 miles to begin my pilgrimage. Now that I can have her only in memory, I see my grandmother in the several postures that were peculiar to her. Standing at the wood stove on a winter morning and turning meat in a great iron skillet. Sitting at the south window, bent above her beadwork, and afterwards, when her vision failed, looking down for a long time into the folds of her hands. Going out upon a cane, very slowly, as she did when the weight of age came upon her, praying. I remember her most often at prayer. I do not speak Kiowa, and I never understood her prayers, but there was something inherently sad in the sound, some merest hesitation upon the syllables of sorrow. She began in a high and descending pitch, exhausting her breath to silence, then again and again, and always the same intensity of effort, of something that is and is not, like urgency in the human voice, transported so in the dancing light among the shadows of her room, she seemed beyond the reach of time. But that was illusion. I think I knew then that I should not see her again. The walls have closed in upon my grandmother's house. When I returned to it in mourning, I saw for the first time in my life how small it was. It was late at night, and there was a white moon nearly full. I sat for a long time on the stone steps by the kitchen door. From there, I could see out across the land. I could see the long row of trees by the creek, the low light upon the rolling plains, and the stars of the Big Dipper. Once, I looked at the moon and caught sight of a strange thing. A cricket had perched upon the handrail, only a few inches away from me. My line of vision was such that the creature filled the moon like a fossil. It had gone there, I thought, to live and die, for there, of all places, was its small definition made whole and eternal. A warm wind rose up and purled like the longing within me. The next morning, I awoke at dawn and went out on the dirt road to Rainy Mountain. It was already hot, and the grasshoppers began to fill the air. Still, it was early in the morning, and the birds sang out of the shadows. The long yellow grass on the mountain shone in the bright light, and a scissortail hide above the land. There, where it ought to be, at the end of a long and legendary way, was my grandmother's grave. Here and there, on the dark stones, were ancestral names. Looking back once, I saw the mountain and came away.
The Gift of the Deer by Helen Hoover. December 26th to February 3rd. In the dimness of early morning, I woke to the sound of wood crackling in the airtight stove and wind roaring in the trees. I slid out of bed, wrapped my wool robe around me, grabbed my clothes, and scooted across the cold floor to toast myself by the stove. As I dressed, Aid came down the path with 2 5-gallon cans of fuel oil on the toboggan. A blast of icy cold air accompanied him and one of the cans inside. "It's 40 below," he said, pouring oil into the big space heater. "And the wind, it's almost at full gale. There isn't a sign of life outside." As the coffee dripped, I looked out the window. The sky was a pale robin's egg blue and perfectly clear. But visibility on the ground was cut to 50 feet by slanting veils of blowing, drifting snow. The wind lifted in its swirls, fanned it out, piled it in long, knife-edged ridges. A beautiful day, but a savage one, hard on man and beast. No wonder the birds and the squirrels were staying in their shelters, waiting for the sun to rise a little higher and perhaps the wind to drop before they came out to feed. Then I saw Peter. With his head down against the wind, he was making his way laboriously from the partial shelter he had found in the maple brush on the hillside. He shook as though he was palsied. He braced himself cautiously before lifting a foot to step forward. Then suddenly he stumbled and went down in the snow. Slowly he gathered his legs under him, pushed up on his knees of his forelegs, straightened his hind legs, and surged fully upright. Then he rested, his nose almost touching the snow, before he again began to move slowly toward the house. As Aid made a smothered sound of pity, I began to fix breakfast for Peter. To the potato skins I'd salvaged the night before and the suit, I added leftover peas, mashed potatoes, turkey gravy, and some of the cracked corn we had kept for the hen. Everything but the corn would freeze in solid minutes. But I didn't think Peter would mind. If he could chew turkey ribs, he could manage mashed potato ice. I tore a big piece of box that waited to be burned in the airtight and put the food on it in separate heaps. When I opened the door, Peter was almost within arm's reach, staring at the cabin with intense concentration. His face so thin that the shape of his skull showed through the ruffed and shot-torn fur, was covered with frost from his breath. His blind eye was frosted shut. He flinched as I stepped outside. Then his nostrils quivered as he smelled the food. His breath came in heavy, straining gasps as he pushed his head forward, mouth open and pink tongue partly out. I put the food on the step and backed inside. He was doubtful of the paper, but after carefully sniffing around its edges, cleaned it to the last crumb, licking it thoroughly as though to make sure nothing had been missed. When he looked at Aid and me through the glass of the kitchen door, his eye no longer dull, and he held his head up with something like confidence. Then he tapped on the step with his hoof, ducked his head several times, and waited tongue tip out. "That's plan enough," Aid said. "He's doing his best to tell us he wants more." "But what can I give him? Maybe a can of peas? Carrots! I ground about 3 times too many yesterday." Aid reached into the icebox, one of the old-fashioned kind, but without ice, and brought out a heaped dish from the bottom, which the cold from the floor chilled enough to make the space our winter vegetable keeper. Peter ate the carrots with enthusiasm. Finished, he licked his lips, captured a small piece that adhered to his black nose, shook his ears, and turned eagerly towards the door. For the first time, I realized that the slight changes of wild animals' facial expressions might, taken together with circumstances, convey meaning to humans. Unless I was greatly mistaken, Peter liked carrots. And I had been wondering what we would do with the bushel and a half of them we had buried in boxes of sand under Ade's drawing table, the only large crop we had taken from our garden in the thin, poor soil of the forest. With the rapid changes of the northern winter, the noontime temperature was up to 0 and the bitter wind had died. I was standing in the yard, enjoying the dry, cold, freshened air and tracing the turquoise zigzags of shadows across the ranks of miniature snow dunes, when I turned and heard Jacques whistling as he snowshoed down Ade's toboggan trail. "What brings you back so soon?" "Just thought I'd ask about the one-eyed Jack." "I brought him a sack of corn," Jacques said, watching Peter eat. I didn't want to say anything until I knew he was still around. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be anywhere pretty soon. And I didn't want to make you feel any worse about that. Jacques was off to lumber camp, and we would not see him again until spring. Mid-February to April 7th. Now Ade and I were bursting with plans for transplanting wildflowers, painting the screens. I even dreamed of opening the windows and letting the fresh breeze clear away the staleness that lingered in the tightly closed cabin. But one day was freezing and damp, the next warm and drizzly, the next white with soggy snow. The shining days were few, but they dwarfed the others in our thoughts. Humans began to stir. Then Jacques came whistling down the path. The thaw had softened the snow in the deep woods and stopped the winter lumbering. While we were sitting over tea and cookies, exchanging the bits of news that fill the gaps left in the local newspaper, Jacques looked out the window and almost dropped his cup. "There's a buck out there!" "That," Ade said smudgingly, "is the one-eyed Jack." While Ade gave a summary of Peter's winter and Jacques gawked, I went into the kitchen to grind carrots and measure grain from the cans underneath the counter. "Now watch," I said, and opened the door. Peter's ears twitched, the tip of his tongue showed pink against his black muzzle, and he walked sedately to the door and peered inside as I picked up the box lid that held his grain. He backed up a step to let me go out and pour the grain in the snow. Then he bent down to eat, so near that I could have buried my fingers in his thick, slate gray coat. When the grain was finished, he looked up expectingly, and I brought him his carrots. Those eaten and his appreciation adequately expressed by a toss of his head and a bounce in his step. He walked over to stand under his tree and chew his cud. Jacques was shaking his head when I rejoined the men. I was born in the woods, but I never thought I'd see that. I've seen tame deer raised from fawns, but I never thought a grown buck would take to people. He comes up to you like a horse. How did you train him? I didn't train him, I said. I let him train me. He's a wild animal like all the others. I give them food and fit my actions to theirs. It's the only way to learn to know them.
I am indebted to Kurt's brother John for introducing me to Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. Years ago, completing my freshman composition course, John presented me with a book, The River Runs Through It. He said he had been given this book by his grandfather. He said it was one of his grandfather's favorites. That summer, I read it on a deck of a Colorado cabin, accompanied by sounds of a nearby river. The River Runs Through It is a beautiful story about family, fly fishing, loss, and eternity. Kurt's reading A River Runs Through It completes a personal legacy. Hamnet is a 2020 historical fiction novel by Northern Irish writer Maggie O'Farrell. It reimagines the life of William Shakespeare's family, focusing on the death of his 11-year-old son, Hamnet, from the plague of 1596, and how this tragedy may have inspired his play Hamlet a few years later. Hamnet, the film, is O'Farrell's adaptation of her novel with director Chloe Kao. Hamlet's world premiere was August 29th, 2025, and the film has received critical acclaim, including being named among the top 10 films of 2025 by the American Film Institute. Dr. Stephen Mintz is a cultural historian at the University of Texas, the author of 14 books. This essay is from his amazing blog on Substack, Luminaire, Reflections on History, the Arts, and the Enduring Questions of Human Existence.
From A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean. In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. We lived at the junction of great trout rivers in western Montana, and our father was a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman who tied his own flies and taught others. He told us about Christ's disciples being fishermen, and we were left to assume, as my brother and I did, that all first-class fishermen on the Sea of Galilee were fly fishermen. It is true that one day a week was given over wholly to religion. On Sunday mornings, my brother Paul and I went to Sunday school and then to morning services to hear our father preach, and in the evenings to Christian Endeavor, and afterwards to evening services to hear our father preach again. In between, on Sunday mornings, we had to study the Westminster Shorter Catechism and then recite before we could walk the hills with him while he unwound between services. But he never asked us more than the first question in the catechism: what is the chief end of man? And we answered together so one of us could carry on if the other forgot. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Even so, in a typical week of our childhood, Paul and I probably received as many hours of instruction in fly fishing as we did in all other spiritual matters. Eventually, he introduced us to the literature on the subject. He tried always to say something stylish as he buttoned the glove on his casting hand. Isaac Walton, he told us, is not a respectable writer. He was an Episcopalian and a bait fisherman. Although Paul was 3 years younger than I was, he was already far ahead of me in anything relating to fishing, and it was he who first found a copy of The Complete Angler and reported, "The bastard doesn't even know how to spell complete." I would like, he said, to get him for a day's fishing on the big Blackfoot with a bet on the side. Paul was very angry, and there has never been a doubt in my mind that he would have taken the Episcopalian money. I never could tell how much my father knew about my brother. I generally assumed that he knew a good deal because there is a substantial minority in every church congregation who regard it as their Christian duty to keep the preacher informed about the preacher's kids. Also, at many times, my father would start to talk to me about Paul, and then he would suddenly just put a lid on it before the subject spilled out. You are too young to help anybody, and I am too old. Help, he said, is giving part of yourself to somebody who comes to accept it willingly and needs it badly. So it is that we can seldom help anybody. Either we don't know what part to give, or maybe we don't like to give any part of ourselves. Then, more often than not, the part that is needed is not wanted. And even more often, we do not have the part that is needed. I told him, you make it too tough. Help doesn't have to be anything that big. That should have been my text, my father said. We're willing to help, Lord, But what, if anything, is needed? I still know how to fish, he concluded. Tomorrow we will go fishing with him. After cleaning my fish, I set these 3 apart with the layer of grass and wild mint. Then I lifted the heavy basket, shook myself into the shoulder strap until it didn't cut anymore, and thought, I'm through for the day. I'll go down and sit on the bank by my father and talk. I could see the sun ahead. The coming burst of light made it look from the shadows that I and a river inside the earth were about to appear on earth. Although I could as yet see only the sunlight and not anything in it, I knew my father was sitting somewhere on the bank. Sorry. I knew partly because he and I shared many of the same impulses, even to quitting at about the same time. I was sure, without as of yet being able to see into what was in front of me, that he was sitting somewhere in the sunshine, reading the New Testament in Greek. The voices of the subterranean river in the shadows were different than the voices of the sunlit river ahead. In the shadows against the cliff, the river was deep and engaged in profundities, circling back on itself now and then to say things over to be sure it had understood itself. But the river ahead came out into the sunny world like a chatterbox, doing its best to be friendly. It bowed to one shore and then to the other, so nothing would feel neglected. By now I could see inside the sunshine, and I had located my father. He was sitting high on the bank. He wore no hat. Inside the sunlight, his faded red hair was once again ablaze, and again in glory. Oh boy. He was reading, although evidently only by sentences, because he often looked away from the book. He did not close the book until some time after he saw me. I scrambled up the bank and I asked him, "How many did you get?" He said, "I got all I want." I asked, "Well, are they any good?" He said, "They are beautiful." He was about the only man I ever knew who used the word beautiful as a natural form of speech, and I guess I picked up the habit from hanging around him. My father always felt shy when compelled to praise one of his family, and his family felt shy when he praised them. My father said, "You are a fine fisherman." Paul said, "I'm pretty good with a rod, but I need 3 more years before I can think like a fish." I said, without knowing how much I said, "You already know how to think like a dead stonefly." We sat on the bank and the river went by. As always, it was making sounds to itself, and it now made sound to us. It would be hard to find 3 men sitting side by side who knew better what a river was saying. A river, though, has so many things to say that it is hard to know what it says to each of us. As we were packing our tackle and fish in the car, Paul repeated, "Just give me 3 more years." At the time, I was surprised by the repetition, but later I realized that the river somewhere, sometime, must have told me too that he would receive no such gift. For when the police sergeant early next May wakened me before daybreak, I rose and I asked no questions. Together we drove across the Continental Divide and down the length of the Big Blackfoot River to tell my father and mother that my brother had been beaten to death by the butt of a revolver and his body dumped in an alley. After a long time, my father came with something he must have wanted to ask from the first. Do you think it was just a stick up and he tried to fight his way out of it? You know what I mean. That it wasn't connected to something in his past. The police don't know, I said. All I really know is that he was a fine fisherman. You know more than that, my father said. He was beautiful. Yes, I said, he was beautiful. He should have been. You taught him. Now nearly all those I loved and did not understand when I was young are dead. But I still reach out to them. Of course, now I am too old to be much of a fisherman. And now, of course, I usually fish the big waters alone, although some friends think I shouldn't. Eventually, all things merge into one, and a river runs through it.
From Hamnet, Hamlet, and the Historical Imagination by Stephen Mintz. The most powerful recent work about Shakespeare's greatest tragedy is not a scholarly monograph, but a novel. And now a major motion picture that the New Yorker has provocatively labeled grief porn. Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, a book that never once utters Shakespeare's name, reshaped how many readers imagine the origins of Hamlet. Chloe Zhao's just released film adaptation has brought this imaginative reconstruction to an even broader audience, visualizing Shakespeare's grief with emotional intensity that has moved audiences to tears, while intensifying debates about biographical speculation and literary interpretation. The New Yorker's label captures something real about the film's emotional strategy, yet risks dismissing what it genuinely accomplishes. This is a work about the death and loss of a child, the struggle to cope with unimaginable loss, and the quest for consolation. Beautifully filmed in a Terrence Malick dreamlike style, the film seeks to provide both insights into Shakespeare's marriage and to recover life as experienced by an Elizabethan woman. Her labor, her herbal knowledge, her navigation of a world that gave her few choices and little voice. But the film is much more about our time as Shakespeare's, about how we've stripped away the resources that helped earlier generations process grief. It's a film for adults, presuming knowledge about Shakespeare's life and willingness to sit through extended scenes of Hamlet, not just the famous soliloquies. Unlike Shakespeare in Love, which played fast and loose with history, this film strives for genuine authenticity in its material culture, emotional textures, and the presentation of early modern domestic life. If the ending is over the top, Adnick's experiencing Hamlet at the Globe as simultaneous catharsis and tribute, the film overall is deeply affecting. O'Farrell begins not with a thick record, but with silence. We know almost nothing about Shakespeare's son Hamnet, who died at 11 in 1596. We lack diaries, letters, and eyewitness testimony. The mother we know as Anne Hathaway appears as Agnes, a name gleaned from a single interlineation in her father's will, reimagined from fleeting legal traces. O'Farrell builds an entire emotional architecture atop spare facts. A marriage in 1582, 3 children, including twins Hamnet and Judith, Hamnet's death in August 1596, Shakespeare writing Hamlet 4 years later. From these bare facts, Hamnet creates a psychological world in which private tragedy becomes the imaginative origin of the most famous meditation on grief and mortality in English literature. Hamlet is not literally about a child's death. It concerns a son's response to his father's murder. Yet its emotional core, the paralysis of grief, the sense of a world drained of meaning, resonates deeply with parental loss. O'Farrell suggests that a father who lost a child might write with particular intensity about a son who lost a father. She never asserts this as historical fact, but offers it as emotional truth, a plausible imaging of how grief might be transmuted into art. Zhao's film makes these connections more explicit and visceral. The film visualizes Shakespeare composing to be or not to be while wrestling with loss. We watch Agnes experience Hamlet at the Globe, her tears offering vicarious catharsis. The film's emotional power is undeniable. Audiences emerge weeping. Shakespeare took a familiar revenge story and turned it into the most searching exploration of human consciousness in Western drama. What he added had no real precedent: a philosophical inquiry into being, action, and mortality. A ghost whose nature and reliability remain radically uncertain. A new level of psychological realism. A more nuanced Ophelia, whose breakdown mirrors Hamlet's own. A graveyard scene meditating on death and time. And a tragic vision grounded in profound and unsettling doubt. Nothing in the earlier versions anticipates the intellectual intensity of Hamlet's soliloquies or the play's fascination with performance, identity, authenticity, and truth. Earlier versions give us a revenge story. Shakespeare gives us a study in what it means to be human in a world where all action is morally compromised, knowledge is uncertain, and death renders meaning indeterminate. The film understands this distinction. This is not Shakespeare in love. This is a film that takes Hamlet as seriously as Hamlet, as a work of philosophical depth that cannot be explained away by biography alone. The label grief porn obscures what the film gets right, that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived through. That art emerges from life's texture while transcending it, and that recovering women's historical experience matters, even when that experience exists only as absence in the archive.
We gather for Winter's Tale in our own Nicholson Library, a special place with a special staff of librarians. Their behind-the-scenes efforts paves the way for Winter's Tale's success. We thank the extraordinary Renelle Thompson and her staff. Thank you, Renelle. Thank you, Krista, Kelly, Craig, Anna, Kelsey, Becky, Justin, Ginger. Thank you, readers, for giving warm words to this cold day. Thank you, Craig and Gary, musicians supreme. Thank you, Randy, for making our voices, our music clear year after year. Thank you, audience, for coming. You are the reason for Winter's Tale. Please stay for the reception, good conversation, good food. Each year, I look for a book in London that speaks to me for A Winter's Tale. On my last day, I found it on display. The cover had swirling gold leaves on a green background. It was called 1,000 Feasts, subtitled A Memoir of Sorts. Small Moments of Joy by Nigel Slater. Slater has been the food columnist for the London Observer 30 years. Every award has been his. His memoir, Toast, The Story of a Boy's Hunger, won 6 major awards and became a film and a stage production. Nigella Lawson described 1,000 Feasts as a prose poem for eaters. Sylvia Plath's poignant poem, Black Rook in Rainy Weather, was discovered in a book called Watch for the Light.
From 1,000 Feasts by Nigel Slater. If you take it slowly, concentrating on your every movement, cooking can be a deeply meditative experience. Rush it, and it becomes purely about the end result, sustenance. Licking the bowl. No chocolate or ginger cake, Victoria sponge, or coffee and walnut cake tastes quite as good as that smudge of raw cake mixture stolen from the bowl. The beaten butter and sugar, eggs and flour have a special temptation all their own. Cool and whipped till cloud-like, it has a hint of soft-serve vanilla ice cream about it. You can't eat much. It has a hint of even a full spoonful, only the merest fingertips worth, a dab, a swoosh. But that is the point. Perhaps it's what makes raw cake mix irresistible. The fact that it must be taken in precious amounts. Excuse me. Anyone who has dipped into excess knows your treat soon cloys. We indulge at our peril. I say licking the bowl, but our delight need not be confined to that. Wiping the extra uncooked cake mixture from the spoon or beater with your index finger is just as good. Seasoned with the false premise of waste not, want not, the raw mixture also carries with it a frisson of the illegal. In cookery classes at school in the late 1960s, we were allowed to lick the black treacle spoon, but not the one we used for golden syrup. And certainly not one smeared with the vanilla-scented delights of raw cake mixture. So we, by which I mean me and all the girls in the class, developed a way of sneaking some with the deftness of a bunch of serial shoplifters. The bacon sandwich. never for breakfast or lunch, and certainly not for supper. The bacon sandwich deserves a special moment all its own. Working outside on a stone-cold day, returning home after a movie or a trip to the pub, rashers of streaky held between two slices of white bread warm the soul like nothing else. Streaky bacon, marbled with creamy fat on dark maroon flesh like Florentine end papers, is my bag. If I have any rules at all, they are that a bacon sandwich should always be slightly too big, never elegant. Cutting one into triangles is unforgivable. Part of the gluttonous joy of such a thing is that it is too large to eat in polite company. In my book, a bacon sandwich is a two-hands job. Today's bacon sandwich is more of a celebration than usual. Dead of winter, but it feels like spring. The snowdrops are out and the sky is a pale, piercing blue. I have just given the zinc table in the garden its first polish of the year. A messy job, but a satisfying one. I pile the bacon on one side of the frying pan, rasher upon crisp rasher, then press one slice of bread into the hot fat. Sponge-like, it sucks up the liqueur and the odd nugget of bacon that has fallen from the rasher. I stop as soon as I can see the ghost of my fingertips appear in the fat on the surface of the bread. I regard these marks as being crucial to the finished thing, as does a potter his stamp or a painter his signature. The joyless would no doubt suggest that grilling your bacon would be a healthier option. But that would leave us bereft of any fat in which to dip our bread. We are talking about a bacon sandwich here. So any conversation about healthy eating is pretty much a non-starter. A bacon sandwich improves my health enormously, by which I mean my mental health. Few curries or pizzas, ice creams or puddings can boost the endorphins quite like a bacon buddy on a cold day. Or any day, come to think of it. The benign intimacy of a spoon. A spoon is naturally soft in the mouth, rounded and smooth, and with that comes a certain gentleness. There is tenderness to a spoon, the way its bowl touches my lower lip. My top gets to feel the liquid inside, its warmth and comfort, before even a drop is swallowed. A spoon is hospitable. It is what I use to put food on my loved one's plate. It is the first thing a baby associates with nourishment after the breast. Its smooth edges and soft shape bring comfort. A fork, with its sharp prongs to spear the food on the plate, feels somewhat violent in comparison. Food eaten from a spoon seems more sustaining than that from a fork, because it often comes surrounded by a pool of broth, sauce, soup, gravy, a little extra puddle of nourishment. A spoon can do little harm. Its lack of edges and points renders it safe, unlike the knife, fork, and even the chopstick. I doubt a spoon has ever been implicated in a murder. The soup spoon, is particularly benign. The wide, shallow bowl allows the surface of the soup to cool quickly, so my tender lips and tongue come to no harm. But it is also wide enough to hold the beans and diced vegetables of a minestrone. I am somewhat saddened by its demise. To be truly comfortable in hand and mouth, the handle, neck, and bowl need to be in harmony. Any spoon will do its job, and I am grateful for that. But finding the right spoon, the perfect shape, weight, and design can add immeasurably to the enjoyment of what is in our bowl or on our plate. Something designers might like to ponder before they try to reinvent this particular wheel. Crumbs. I surreptitiously lick my finger and dab at the stray crumbs on my plate. Soft, fat nuggets of dark ginger cake. A tiny smudge of lemon icing. Then I run my damp finger around the plate clockwise in a final circular motion, gathering up the last stray freckles of a brown spice cake. There isn't a crumb I don't like. The shattered crust of a baguette, the rounded pink and yellow remains of a slice of birthday sponge, the last currant from an eclise cake, or flake of puff pastry from a sausage roll. There are the spongy, butter-coated crumbs of a crumpet, the lost nib of candied peel from a hot cross bun, or the sugary rubble that lies at the bottom of a dish of apple crumble. The truth is, all crumbs are good. Not that all crumbs are sweet, mind you. The crisp, frilly bits of batter from the fried fish rescued from their paper were a childhood treat. And now I feel much the same about the swirls and swashes I make on a plate with bits of fat, waxy-fleshed sourdough and the last spots of olive oil. I am unsure whether picking up crumbs is an act of waste not or gluttony. But nevertheless, I perform the act discreetly. As a cook, seeing someone wipe every last crumb from their plate is heartwarming. As an eater, I think of it as a matter of housekeeping. Crumbs are precious. The last minuscule fragments of cake or cookie or toast. Diminutive, but not insignificant. How anyone can leave them on a plate is beyond me. Mopping the final vestiges of cake with a damp finger and bringing them gently to the lips is as important to me as was the first forkful. It brings a sense of closure, a sign of affection, a show of gratitude. I love my job. There isn't a day, not one single day, when I am not grateful for it. Imagine a job that allows you to make a living out of making something nice to eat and then writing about it. Mind you, there's also been a hell of a lot of washing up. Black Rook in Rainy Weather by Sylvia Plath. On the stiff twig up there hunches a wet black rook, arranging and rearranging its feathers in the rain. I do not expect a miracle or an accident to set the sight on fire in mine eye, nor seek any more in the desultory weather some design. But let spotted leaves fall as they fall, without ceremony or portent. Although I admit I desire occasionally some back talk from the mute sky, I can't honestly complain. A certain minor light might lean incandescent out of kitchen table or chair, as if a celestial burning took possession of the most obtuse objects now and then, thus hallowing an interval otherwise inconsequent by bestowing largesse, honor, one might even say love. At any rate, I now walk wary, for it could happen, even in this dull, ruinous landscape, skeptical yet politic, ignorant of whatever angel may choose to flare suddenly at my elbow. I only know that a rook ordering its black feathers can so shine as to seize my senses, haul my eyelids up, and grant a brief respite from fear of total neutrality. With luck, trekking stubborn through this season of fatigue, I shall patch together a content of sorts. Miracles occur, if you care to call those spasmodic tricks of radiance miracles. The wait's begun again. The long wait for the angel, for that rare, random descent.